In the middle of a rain-soaked forest, the dawn seemed like a living animal, breathing heavily among twisted trees and thick mud. The gunshots, once constant, now came infrequent, short bursts, almost like desperate sobs from a platoon on the verge of disappearing. Each explosion illuminated the wet trunks with quick flashes, revealing American soldiers trapped, covered in dirt, blood, and fear. And there, in the center of absolute chaos, was he, holding a radio held together with duct tape, patched with pieces of metal, exposed wires and a button that needed to be pressed with a fingernail to work. A radio that everyone laughed at when they saw it. A radio that everyone called scrap. A radio that, at that moment, was the only bridge between life and death. The protagonist crawled behind a fallen tree trunk as the enemy advanced like a relentless wave, machine guns spitting fire and grenades shaking the ground. Each shot seemed closer, as if the enemy were tasting victory even, before conquering the territory. The voices of his comrades around him were no longer shouts of command, but failed sounds, muffled groans, breaths fading. The air smelled of gunpowder, wet earth, and despair. At any second, everything would collapse. He tried to keep the radio pressed against his chest, adjusting the tape with trembling hands, fingers dirty with mud and blood. It only works if I hold it like this. It only needs to work for 30 seconds. Just 30 damn seconds, he murmured to himself. The makeshift antenna swayed with each explosion, and every time he pressed the transmit button, the device hissed like a wounded animal. But it was this or nothing. It was the last chance, the last cry for help, the last bombardment that could turn the tide of the battle before the enemy crushed everything. And then, in a moment frozen in time, he exposed himself by inches to try and find a signal. The enemy saw. 3 shots hit the trunk next to his face, splintering wood. Other bursts swept the ground, kicking up mud and leaves. He took a deep breath, pressed the radio button hard, and the device emitted only a high-pitched, dead, empty hiss. "No, not now. For God's sake," he whispered, as a shadow loomed ahead, an enemy soldier raising his weapon, aiming directly at him. There was no time to run, no time to try again. It was the end. The broken radio was silent. The sound of the enemy advance was inevitable, and as his vision began to narrow, as death seemed to reach out, a hidden truth approached. Something no one on that battlefield imagined a simple man with a radio tied with tape was about to do. Something that would change the course of that night and that war. Something that would prove that everyone, absolutely everyone, had been completely wrong about him. Did you notice how everything that's happened so far seemed to push that soldier towards certain death, but at the same time left the feeling that something gigantic was still going to change? If this story has already captivated you like this from the start, take advantage and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest. Seriously, there's a lot of powerful stuff coming up. Also, leave a like to help this video reach more people, and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I love knowing how far these stories reach. The story goes back in time, long before that dawn soaked in gunpowder and fear, to reveal the root of everything that no one in the platoon could see. Because to understand why that man held a patched-up radio as if it were his very soul, it's necessary to go back to the American heartland, to a piece of land that seemed forgotten by the world, a place where the rain was slow to arrive, but when it did, it turned everything into mud, the same mud that now covered his uniform in the forest. Growing up there wasn't simple, much less comfortable. It was the kind of life where the day began before the sun and ended, long after it disappeared. A life where repairs were never made with new parts but with what was nearby. A piece of wire, an old hinge, a bent nail found on the barn floor. And it was in this scenario of poverty and constant improvisation that he learned something that most soldiers would never imagine using in war. Everything can work, as long as you find the right way to fit the broken pieces together. His father, a farmer of few words and a stern expression, always repeated the same phrase: "If it's broken, it can be fixed. If it can't be fixed, you can still find a way." And that boy grew up with that ingrained in his mind. He repaired the old tractor that should have already been scrapped. He saved the water pump that kept failing every 3 days. He held doors together with rope, fastened panels with tape, improvising in ways that would make any modern engineer faint. But everything worked. Maybe not beautifully or elegantly, But it worked. And in that rural world, that was what mattered. When he enlisted in the army, it wasn't because he dreamed of glory, nor because he wanted to be a hero. It was because the farm was failing and he needed to send money home. Military life, however, wasn't made for men who improvised. It was rigid, indoctrinated, full of rules that couldn't or shouldn't be questioned. But he didn't know how to function any other way. When he saw something broken, his instinct wasn't to wait for orders. It was to get his hands dirty. And that irritated his superiors. The radio incident began long before the day of the battle. During an exercise, the equipment fell down a ravine and hit the rocks. The official operator said it was dead. The sergeant ordered it discarded. And everyone laughed when the protagonist picked up the radio, turned it in his hand, examined the wires and said, "I think it can be salvaged." It seemed like a joke, but he opened the radio casing with the tip of his bayonet, rearranged the internal cables, used duct tape from the medical kit, ripped a small piece of metal from his own sling to make contact, and got the radio working. Not perfectly, but enough to transmit. From that day on, the jokes began. The farmer thinks he's an engineer, the tape wizard, the scrapyard operator, and the worst of all, when the radio explodes, it's his fault. He laughed on the outside, but every comment weighed heavily. Still, every time the equipment malfunctioned, which happened a lot in damp soil, extreme, cold or storms, he was the one who fixed it. Always improvising, always patching things up, always finding solutions that no manual taught. And it was precisely because of this that the day before the battle, when the main radio suffered a total failure, everyone looked at it with that mixture of mockery and hope. The official operator said there was no way to save it. The officers debated whether they should recall the platoon or continue without communication. And he, once again, asked for the radio. When he sat in the mud to dismantle it, he heard behind him, "That thing won't last another day, it's dead." He simply replied, "Most of the things I fixed were too." That's where the real disagreement between him and the others began. Not because they doubted his ability, but because they were afraid. Trusting a patched-up radio in enemy territory was like gambling their lives with a loaded coin. If the radio failed, they would die. If it worked, no one would ever forget. He knew this responsibility, and that's why he worked on the radio as if he were tending to the heart of a wounded animal. He cut pieces from his own helmet strap to insulate burned parts. He adjusted the antenna with wire salvaged from an ammunition box, and he spent more than 40 minutes testing frequencies until he found one that worked, even with interference. When he finally lifted the radio, tied from top to bottom with tape, held together with patches and structured by pure mechanical instinct, he heard a comment that stuck in his head. "If this thing works tomorrow, I swear I'll buy you a beer." He laughed. Not because he wanted the beer, but because he knew that tomorrow it might be too late for anyone to drink anything. That night, before the enemy offensive, he stood watching the radio propped up in the corner of the trench, illuminated only by the faint glow of the moon. It was ugly, makeshift, crooked, and yet it was the only thing that gave him a sense of control amidst the chaos. He ran his finger along the duct tape, which was already beginning to peel at the edges, and whispered to himself, "Just hold on one more day, just one more." What no one knew, not the platoon, not the officers, not the enemy, was that radio, ridiculed, patched up, and discredited, would be the center of the battle that was about to happen. And as the cold dawn wind blew over the camp, he felt deep in his chest that something was coming, something inevitable, something that would put his improvisation to the test, far beyond any repair he had ever made in his life. And when the first shot of the enemy offensive echoed in the darkness, he knew that the fate of that patch of tape would not be merely to try to survive. It would be to become the unlikely weapon that would define the course of everyone in that forest. Because sometimes it is at the absolute limit, in desperation and improvisation, that a simple man reveals the kind of greatness that no one believed he possessed. And the battle about to begin would prove it in the most brutal way possible. When hell finally broke loose on the platoon that grey morning, it all happened too fast for anyone to react. The first enemy burst ripped through the advance line like wet paper. The Americans scrambled for makeshift positions, dove into the mud, sought cover behind trees, craters, and the remains of burnt logs. The ground trembled with each explosion, and the air thickened, filled with dust, gunpowder, and a suffocating feeling that none of this was under control. And at the epicenter of this chaos, there he was, clutching the patched-up radio tightly, trying to keep the antenna pointed at the only spot where there might still be a signal. It was like trying to keep a candle burning in the middle of a hurricane. The enemy advanced along the left flank, using the tall vegetation as cover. It was a precise, almost choreographed maneuver, typical of those who knew how to explore the terrain better than any map could reveal. Every time an American soldier raised his head to observe, a burst of gunfire immediately came, forcing everyone to keep their faces pressed against the mud. He heard the sergeant's shouts trying to organize a desperate defense, but it was like shouting in the middle of a storm. Nobody really heard anything. The only thing that could still change that fate was the radio that, at that moment, seemed to have a life of its own, oscillating between short statics and silences that seemed endless. He pressed the button, spoke the coordinates, repeated them with trembling clarity, but the response never came. The interference was unbearable. The air seemed charged with electricity, as if the environment itself was sabotaging any attempt at communication. A grenade exploded so close that he fell sideways, rolling through the mud, feeling his whole body vibrate with the impact. The radio slipped from his hands, and for a second that seemed endless, he watched the device bounce in the mud, get wet, dirty, almost disappear under a dark puddle. His heart stopped. Because losing that radio wasn't like losing a tool or a piece of equipment, it was losing his only real chance of survival. He crawled along, ignoring the growing sound of the advancing enemy. Bullets hit the tree trunk ahead, sending shrapnel flying, but he could only think of one thing: get the radio back. When he finally got his hand on the device, he felt it was soaked. The adhesive tape was already peeling off in places. The exposed wires were covered in mud, and at that moment he felt something break inside him, a mixture of fear, anger, and a strange calm that appears when everything seems about to end. He cleaned the radio with his dirty sleeves, tightened the antenna, reconnected one of the connectors, and tried to call again. Static, more static, almost nothing. And then something unexpected happened. An enemy shot hit the branch above his head, scattering wood and leaves on top of him. The shock made his hand tremble, and unintentionally, he touched two exposed wires at the same time. The radio emitted a different sound, a sharp crackle, followed by a cleaner hiss. He froze. He pressed the button. He spoke. And for the first time since the attack began, a faint voice answered from the other end. Distant, almost inaudible, but real. It was like hearing a whisper from the sky. He repeated the coordinates urgently, trying to remain calm as he felt his entire body pulsing with adrenaline. The enemy noticed the movement and began concentrating fire in that direction. The ground around him exploded, the trees vibrated. The soldiers in his platoon shouted for him to get down, but he couldn't. Not now. Not when he finally had a glimmer of hope. The operator on the other end asked for confirmation. The transmission cut out twice. He almost threw the device to the ground in frustration, but he held on tight, took a deep breath, and tried again. The answer came short, cold, and to the point. Understood. Bombardment requested. Please wait. Wait. That word seemed like a cruel joke in the middle of a jungle that was swallowing itself whole. Because, now that the order had been given, he needed to survive long enough to see the bombing fall, and more importantly, he needed to ensure that his platoon wasn't hit as well. He began shouting instructions to the sergeant, indicating that everyone should retreat a few meters to avoid the impact. It was difficult to hear anything amidst the gunfire, but the sergeant noticed the desperation on his face and began to slowly move the men back, even without fully understanding why. The enemy, noticing the movement, increased their advance. They came fast, aggressively, like someone who knows the final blow is within reach. He pressed the radio against his chest, trying to protect it with his own body, as if it was something alive. With each passing second, he wondered if the bombardment would really come. And if it did, if it would come in time, and if it came in time, if it would fall in the right place. Suddenly the sky began to tremble. It was subtle at first, like a distant vibration, an almost ghostly presence. But within seconds the sound grew louder, heavier, more menacing. He recognized it immediately. It was the sound of airplanes. It was the sound that would determine who would live and who would die that day. He felt an enormous weight steal his breath, not from fear, but from knowing that everything depended on the accuracy of that request made in the midst of madness. The jungle plunged into an eerie silence, as if all the trees were holding their breath. And then the first impact occurred. The ground trembled with absurd force, throwing mud everywhere. The enemy was caught off guard, completely disorganized, retreating hastily. The second impact landed closer, hurling bodies, breaking tree trunks, opening craters. He ducked, protecting the radio and his head, feeling the wave of heat wash over him like a dragon's breath. Each explosion seemed to rewrite the fate of the battle, and he knew that, at that very moment, everything was changing. The platoon, which minutes before had been doomed, now had a real chance. A chance that wouldn't have existed without that patched-up radio, without that makeshift device, without that man whom nobody took seriously. As the bombardment continued, he realized something he hadn't understood until then. The enemy, that disciplined, ruthless, precise army, was afraid, a fear that only exists when the impossible happens before your eyes, and he knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same, because for the first time, the power of that improvisation was beginning to take the form of a legend that was far from over. After the bombardment that tore through the jungle and turned the enemy line inside out, there was a feeling in the air that no soldier could explain. It wasn't relief. It wasn't victory. It was something deeper, more instinctive, the realization that this simple man covered in mud with a patched-up radio in his lap had done something that no military manual could ever have predicted. The platoon breathed heavily, coughing up the dust that still lingered after the explosions, but they were beginning to realize that they were alive because of him. And ironically, it was now that his true transformation was beginning, not as an operator, not as a soldier, but as psychological weapon. In that war, ingenious tricks and improbable solutions were rare. Battles depended on numbers, tactics, and equipment, but he wasn't made of those things. He was made of improvisation, of rural stubbornness, of that almost primitive instinct to find paths where only walls existed. And it is precisely at that moment, when the platoon reorganizes, when the enemy retreats for seconds, when the silence after the storm dominates the field, that the trick that would change his reputation forever is born. The ability to transform limitation into advantage. That wasn't just a patched-up radio. It was a complete war system created by force, with tape, wire, mud, and intuition. As the soldiers retreated to their defensive positions, he immediately turned on the radio. The others thought he was checking for damage, but no, he was adjusting a modification that only he knew how to use. It was a makeshift device that allowed transmission on an unstable frequency, which official operators would classify as unsafe and unpredictable, but precisely for that reason, it was a frequency that the enemy couldn't intercept or track. The kind of solution that only comes about when someone spends years saving machines about to die on farms, where everything depended on improvisation. He tightened the tape further, realigned the antenna, and cleaned the contacts with a soaked piece of cloth. This made the radio ugly, crooked, almost comical, but extremely dangerous. And that's where the rise began. The enemy, stunned by the bombardment, was trying to reorganize its troops. They couldn't understand how the Americans managed to call in artillery so quickly, without interference, without fail. It was as if there was a ghost operating on invisible frequencies, and in a way there was. With the radio tuned, he began to coordinate movements that no trained operator would have dared to attempt, not because they were forbidden, but because they required absolute precision, irrational courage, and an absurd confidence in his own makeshift equipment. He didn't call in bombing raids just to attack. He called them in to distract, to confuse, to divide. He sent false coordinates that made the enemy move to positions where they would be ambushed moments later. It was as if, suddenly, he was playing chess with an invisible board, and the enemy was playing checkers. American officers began to realize that something different was happening. Enemy advances were being interrupted by attacks that seemed to predict exactly where they were going. The platoon, previously just surviving, was now dominating territory, dominating positions, dominating morale. Meanwhile, on the opposite side, a silent fear was growing. Reports began circulating among enemy troops. They had a specific expression to describe what was happening: the ghost operator. For them, it made no sense that a small platoon would have continuous access to air and artillery. Support in the middle of the jungle, with the weather interfering with all frequencies. The conclusion? There could only be a highly advanced, trained, specialist operator, an infiltrator, or even an unknown technology. It was impossible to imagine that the mind behind it was an American farmer with a radio that looked like a poorly made school project. And this is where psychological terror comes in. The more he used the trick, the more precise it became. The more precise, the more devastating it became. In a short time, the enemy no longer attacked in an organized manner. They advanced hesitantly. They retreated for no apparent reason. They plunged into the woods in complete panic at the slightest static on the American radio. It was as if each transmission was a warning of impending disaster, and in fact it was. He had achieved something extremely rare in war, breaking the enemy's trust. But this rise came at a cost. Each new operation required manual adjustments to the radio. The device would overheat, malfunction, crackle, need to be rewired and require new improvised wires ripped from backpacks, canteens, flashlights, and even unused ammunition. He began to suffer burns on his hands from holding overheated metal contacts. His voice became hoarse from transmitting under pressure. His eyes burned from smoke, lack of sleep, and constant adrenaline. He was becoming lethal, yes, but at the cost of his own physical and mental health, and there was an even greater price to pay. Now the enemy knew they had to eliminate him. They still didn't know who he was. They didn't know what he looked like. They didn't know his exact position. But they knew there was an operator, a single operator, who was changing the course of the battle. And so they began sending out specific patrols to locate transmissions. Experienced hunters, snipers, elite units trained to identify radio waves and neutralize the source. He didn't know it yet, but every time he pressed the transmission button, he was lighting an invisible light saying, "I'm here, come get me." The brilliant trick had worked. It had turned the tide. It had created panic among the enemy, admiration among the Allies, and a historic turning point in the battle. But along with the improvised glory came a silent, almost prophetic warning. The higher someone climbs, the faster the world tries to bring them down. And he was about to discover this in the most brutal way possible, because the enemy no longer just wanted to win the battle. I wanted to silence the radio announcer forever. The silence that followed those improvised transmissions was deceptive, almost treacherous. It wasn't peace. It wasn't a pause. It was merely the interval between the impact of a revelation and the beginning of a brutal pursuit. The enemy now knew that there was an operator capable of manipulating unpredictable frequencies, ordering impossible bombings, anticipating movements, and disrupting entire battalions, and that this operator was hidden somewhere in that humid jungle, covered in fog, mud, and bodies. They didn't know his name. They didn't know he was just a farmer, but they knew they needed to destroy him. And fast. That's where it started. The hunt. In the following days, everything changed. The enemy began to ignore other targets and focus exclusively on locating transmissions. Every time he pressed the button, even for a second, even to adjust coordinates, an automatic response came from the field. Concentrated artillery, the sounds of enemy footsteps, snipers relocating, patrols surrounding seemingly random areas. He realized this quickly. He realized it the first time he called for a simple correction, and 2 enemy soldiers appeared behind him, as if guided by a magnet. His best friend, a 22-year-old from Texas, narrowly escaped being hit by a shot coming from a hill that had previously seemed safe. From that moment on, every transmission was a calculated risk, and the price of that risk began to accrue interest. He no longer slept. The smoke from the bombings and the constant tension burned his eyes from the inside. The radio, which had once been his trump card, now seemed like a hungry animal, always on the verge of devouring its own life. The antenna broke. The tape came loose. The wires snapped. He improvised, until his hands began to bleed, until his skin cracked, until calluses formed on his fingertips from holding contacts that were too hot for too long. But even weakened, even exhausted, even carrying the weight of being hunted by an entire army, he continued doing what he knew best, turning the impossible to his advantage. And that's how the operation that defined not only that day, but his entire reputation unfolded. A massive enemy attack planned and coordinated by experienced officers advanced through the early morning with the intention of crushing the platoon once and for all. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds. The ground trembled with the synchronized steps of the troops. The jungle seemed to bow before them. It was the kind of attack that no one would survive. He knew that if he didn't call for backup immediately, the platoon would be wiped out in minutes. But he also knew that if he transmitted at that moment, enemy trackers would find his exact position. It was suicide. It was like lighting a beacon in the middle of the darkness and saying, "Here, kill me now." Even so, he pressed the button. It was a simple gesture, but one that carried a courage that no general, no manual, no strategic plan could teach. He pressed the button, knowing he was signing his own death warrant, and he conveyed it with clarity, precision, and calm, like someone who accepts the weight of destiny with the strength of someone who has spent their whole life fixing things that others gave up trying to save. The first enemy shot passed so close to his face that he felt the hot air cut his cheek. The second hit a tree behind him, sending splinters flying onto the back of his neck. The third grazed his shoulder, drawing a jet of blood. But he didn't let go of the radio, he didn't let go of the antenna, he didn't stop transmitting. He repeated the coordinates until he was sure they had been received. And then, only then, did he allow the radio to fall from his hands. When the bombardment began, the entire jungle trembled. The enemy was engulfed in fire and metal. The platoon, which seconds before had faced its own extinction, now saw hope born in explosions that illuminated the cloudy sky. It was a bombardment so precise, so surgical, so impossible to carry out in a jungle with interference that there was only one explanation. Someone down there had transmitted perfect coordinates, and that someone was him. But victory did not come without a price. The final explosion hit him even from afar, a shockwave strong enough to throw him against the ground. His vision darkened, sounds became distant, and he felt as if he were sinking into icy water. The radio, broken for good, lay beside him like a dead soldier, and for the first time since the beginning of the battle, he didn't even have the strength to lift his own head. He survived, but only because another soldier dragged him behind a tree trunk before the completely disoriented enemy could hit him. When he finally regained consciousness hours later, he was being carried out of the jungle, surrounded by faces that watched him with a mixture of astonishment and silent respect. The sergeant, the one who had once mocked the patched-up radio, squeezed his shoulder and said something he would never forget. "Your patches saved us all." The war would continue. There would be other battles, other stories. But there on that day he had become more than just an improvised operator. He had become the symbol of something much greater, living proof that sometimes genius is born from improvisation and courage is born from desperation. When he finally returned home months later, no one recognized him as a hero. He came back as he had left, a simple man with calloused hands, rural habits, and a calm way of looking at the world. He kept the broken radio on a shelf in the barn, not as a trophy, but as a memento of the day the impossible bowed down to an ordinary man. And whenever someone asked him what he did in the war, he would humbly reply, "I just fixed what was broken." But the truth, the one that books, surviving soldiers, and the enemy would never forget, was that he didn't just fix it. He changed an entire battle. He changed destinies. He changed stories. And it all started with a radio tied with tape, ridiculed by everyone, until the day it saved dozens of lives and became a legend. The following days were not days. They were sieges, psychological torture, and survival on a razor's edge. After the all-night bombardment that saved the platoon, the enemy understood that they were not only fighting American soldiers, they were fighting a man capable of ordering destruction with millimeter precision in the middle of a jungle that swallowed signals, confused compasses, and distorted frequencies. This revelation led the enemy command to make a brutal decision. The operator needed to be eliminated at all costs. It didn't matter how many men were diverted from the main front. It didn't matter if it delayed other offensives. That single operator, the ghost of the tape, as they began to call him, had become more dangerous than an entire platoon armed to the teeth. The hunt began silently, first with infiltrated observers. experienced men, trained to listen to the sound of the transmission in the air, to follow tracks, to identify even the breathing pattern of a hidden operator. They moved like shadows through the dense vegetation, studying every sound that arose. Then came the snipers, who positioned themselves on strategic hills and clearings, waiting hours, sometimes days, to detect a metallic glint, a reflection, the slightest movement of an improvised antenna. But none of that seemed enough, because he didn't transmit like ordinary operators. He transmitted with survival intelligence. He transmitted with fear. He transmitted like someone who knew that every second in the air was like being displayed in a shop window in the middle of a minefield. Even so, he needed to broadcast it. Each request, each correction, each confirmation, each message he sent was a signed sentence. But it was also a lifeline, and that consumed him from the inside. The pressure was so intense that he began to experience involuntary tremors in his hands. At night, sleep came in short, confused bursts, always interrupted by explosions, gunfire, or nightmares of enemies pointing weapons directly at his head. Food no longer went down properly. His stomach was always churning, as if each meal were an additional weight pushing him deeper into the jungle. And yet, he continued, the worst part wasn't the attack. It was the waiting. Waiting for the inevitable. Waiting for the moment when the enemy would finally find him. He felt it in the air, a silent, almost physical pressure, as if the jungle were trying to warn him. The birds sang less. The branches broke at strange times. The wind seemed to carry distant footsteps. The natural paranoia of the battlefield now mixed with a genuine, deep fear that tightened his chest and quickened his breathing. He began to think he saw silhouettes where there was no one, that he heard breaths where there was only wind, that he felt eyes watching him when he was alone adjusting the radio, and he wasn't wrong. On the third night after the bombing, the sergeant woke him with a slap on the shoulder. It wasn't from explosions, nor from gunfire. It was from something far worse. Silence. A silence so profound it seemed impossible in a living jungle. A silence that foreshadowed death. The sergeant pointed to the surroundings. Enemy flashlights had been seen a few hours away. Specialized troops were approaching. They weren't trying to take territory. They were trying to surround, infiltrate, strangle, like wolves hunting a wounded animal that insists on fighting. The platoon began to move with the urgency of those who know they are being hunted. But it was no use. The jungle was vast, yes, but not large enough to hide someone who needed, eventually, to press a button that made noise. And when the enemy offensive finally fell upon them, without warning, without hesitation, without warning shots, everything crumbled. It was as if the enemy had been waiting for that exact moment. The platoon barely had time to run for cover. The first shot hit the youngest soldier, who fell without making a sound. The second struck a tree, splitting a huge sliver, and the third passed so close to his head that it cut a hair before disappearing into the darkness. He instinctively fell to the ground, shielding the radio with his body like a child. The antenna bent. The tape tore. Part of the panel cracked. And for the first time since he improvised the device, he felt fear not only of the war, but of losing the radio. Because at that point, broadcasting was no longer just a job. It was his identity. It was his contribution. It was the only reason he was alive, and perhaps the only reason the platoon was still breathing. The sergeant yelled for them to abandon the equipment and run, but he didn't hear, or he heard, and simply didn't obey. But not out of stubbornness, out of instinct. An instinct that told him that if he let go of that radio now, it would be like abandoning his own destiny. He tried to get up, but a sharp pain shot through his chest. Only then did he realize he had been hit by shrapnel from a grenade. Warm blood trickled down the side of his shirt. His left arm trembled uncontrollably. His breath came in short, painful gasps. But even so, he gripped the radio with his right hand, with enough force to leave his fingers white. The enemy was advancing too fast. Rifles gleamed in the darkness. Boots crushed leaves and twigs. They were close, very close. The adrenaline was so strong he could barely feel his own weight. It was pure survival, pure desperation. He tried to adjust the antenna with a trembling hand, knowing this could be his last transmission. But the wires were loose. The tape no longer held. The antenna was almost broken in half. At that moment, something inside him broke and was reborn at the same time. He saw in his mind the field where he grew up, the old tractor without a wheel, the rusty water pump, the makeshift tools, his father's voice, "If it's broken, it can be fixed." And with his breath failing, his body bleeding, the world crumbling around him, he did the unthinkable. He used his own blood as a conductor. He ran 2 bloodied fingers over the exposed contact, creating the missing connection. The radio crackled, emitted an electrical click, and then a faint sound, a faint life, a faint chance. But it was a chance. He pressed the button. He transmitted, choking. He didn't know if anyone on the other end heard him. I didn't know if he would fall before finishing. He didn't know if the enemy was already behind him, pointing a weapon. But he transmitted anyway. Because transmitting in that state, in that condition, in that hell, was more than a military act. It was an act of faith. And there, on the boundary between life and death, between light and darkness, between glory and oblivion, something was about to happen that would change everything. Something that would make that broadcast not just a desperate attempt, but part of the legacy he never imagined building. Because sometimes the price of greatness isn't just blood, pain, or sacrifice. It's about continuing to broadcast, even when the whole world tries to silence you. The instant that followed the last transmission didn't seem real. He was on the ground, breathless, the radio pressed against his chest as if it were the last piece of life. The blood that ran down his arm no longer burned. It was cold, almost numb. The jungle around him seemed blurry, the shadows moving as if breathing. He didn't know if he had been heard. He didn't know if he had a few more seconds, or if the next enemy step would be the final sound of his existence. But even so, he kept his hand on the radio, squeezing tightly, as if the loose tape and broken wires could still protect him somehow. And then, at the exact moment, his eyelids began to droop. A distant sound cut through the night, a deep, familiar sound, the roar of airplanes. He opened his eyes with effort, unsure if he was dreaming, delirious, or truly hearing it. But the sound grew louder, clearer, more real. The wind shifted. The earth began to vibrate. He tried to lift his head, but his body wouldn't obey. The enemy, approaching for the final attack, stopped. It fell silent. It looked up. Darkness exploded into light. Aerial artillery rained down like thunder on the jungle. The first explosions illuminated frightened faces, weapons being dropped, soldiers running without coordination. It was absolute chaos. But for the first time, it wasn't chaos that condemned. It was chaos that saved. Each bomb delivered the certainty that yes, he had been heard. Yes, someone on the other side understood his weak and distorted plea. Yes, his transmission, made literally with blood, had pierced through the interference, the jungle, the fear, and destiny. The platoon, believing it was living its last minute, watched the enemy engulfed in fire and smoke. It was as if the heavens had decided to intervene, as if the war, for a second, obeyed the will of a single man. The sergeant shouted orders, reorganized the line, and ordered that no one approach him. The operator. They knew he needed help, but they also knew that if they moved an inch wrong in that illuminated inferno, they would be hit. He, however, saw none of that. All he could see was the radio. Beside him, definitively broken. A bent piece of metal, dirty with mud, blood, and soot, and despite being destroyed, it seemed almost dignified, as if it had fulfilled its final mission. The final shockwave hit him with enough force to knock him out completely. His body lay motionless among burnt roots and leaves as the battle ended before him. He didn't see the enemy retreat in despair, abandoning equipment. He didn't see the platoon advance to secure the position. He didn't see the sergeant kneel beside him, pressing his wound to stop the bleeding. He didn't see the medics improvising a stretcher. He saw nothing. He simply rested, for the first time since the beginning of that war. When he woke up, he wasn't in the jungle. He was in a makeshift white tent, with the distant sounds of voices, boots, and metal. A nurse looked at him and smiled, like someone recognizing someone who had overcome something that shouldn't have been overcome. "You're alive," she said. It took him a few seconds to process. Then he asked about the radio. The nurse laughed, thinking he was delirious. "The radio doesn't matter anymore. You did it. We won." That sentence weighed like lead on his chest, because for him, the radio mattered. The radio was everything. It was his weapon, his tool, his companion. He tried to get up, but the pain was too strong. It was then that the sergeant entered the tent with a serious, tired but respectful look. He stopped beside him, took a deep breath, and said, "We're only here because you held onto that damn thing until the end. That thing should be in a museum." He didn't answer. He just closed his eyes and let a tear roll down his cheek. It wasn't the emotion of victory. It was the exhaustion of someone who had carried the world on his chest and finally could let it fall. The following days were spent in recovery. His name circulated among companies, battalions, and officers. The accounts were exaggerated, romanticized, almost legendary. He transmitted while bleeding. He used his own blood as a source of contact. He called for bombardment with his last breath. But no one knew the simple truth. He simply did what he had always done since childhood: fix what was broken, find a way where there seemed to be no solution, improvise, resist, persist, not out of heroism but out of nature. When the war ended, he refused grand honors, he refused speeches, he refused extra medals. He returned to the farm, to the dry land, to the wooden barn, to the life he had always known. He stored his things in a dark corner, except for one, the broken, patched-up, burnt, unusable radio. He placed it on the highest shelf, right where the late afternoon light streamed in. Sometimes he would stare at the device for long minutes, in silence, not out of nostalgia for the war, but out of respect for what he had done, for what he had survived, for what he represented. He never told the whole story to anyone. The neighbors would ask what he did in the war, and he would answer with the same simple smile, "Oh, nothing. I just tinkered with an old radio." But the platoon knew, the surviving enemies knew, the military command knew, and history, the history that circulated through the corridors, the camps, the reports, knew too. An ordinary man with a radio tied to his phone with tape turned the tide of an entire battle, and that would never cease to resonate. What did this story teach you about how a single gesture, even from an ordinary person, can change everything? I'd love to hear your opinion, so leave a comment below about what struck you most. And if you enjoyed this journey of courage and improvisation, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. That way you can follow future stories and continue being part of this community that values powerful accounts like this one.